Thank you for watching. These are my thoughts on, a summary of, a debate between Georgia Purdom and Dennis Venema. This debate was a while ago. It was before the Ark was built. Well, I mean the Ark Encounter built by Answers in Genesis. Georgia Purdom went first and pointed out that worldview matters as to how you look at the evidence. It's going to affect what you're looking for, what you think things mean. She read from the Answers in Genesis statement of faith, which people who work for Answers in Genesis are required to complete, to believe. She gave a summary of the creation and Noah's flood, pointed out that they're all looking at the same evidence. Dennis Venema doesn't have a different Grand Canyon. It's the same Grand Canyon everyone's looking at. She talked about what historical science is. Historical science, if you could call it science, is different than observational science. Looking into the past and trying to figure out the past is different than figuring out current things like how much electricity one certain element lets flow through it and things like that. Because you can always retest those and be very certain about them. But the distant past, and the further back you go, the harder it is to figure things out. And like what happened 60 years ago, we've still got witnesses of some things that happened in the recent past. And she talked about how creation and evolution doesn't fit into that category. She talked about mutations and what they are. She made the claim there are no beneficial mutations. At least, if there is a beneficial mutation, it's because information is lost, not because new body parts have been witnessed being formed by people. Witnessed by people being formed because of mutations. She pointed out the bacteria in some of the laboratory experiments are not fit. When they get into the laboratory, they lose some things. They lose their flagellum. They lose processing of certain foods. And she talked about what makes them resistant to antibiotics, the ones that are at least. She talked about natural selection and evolution and compared the two. She talked a little bit about the tree of life and the orchard of life. Georgia Purdom's understanding is speciation is something that does happen, but there are limits to how far things can change. So an accurate drawing of life on this earth will be an orchard and not one tree. Mutations don't add information, she pointed out. She talked about the origin of humanity, human and chimp similarities, and molecular clocks. Dennis Venema had his turn to make his first presentation. He talked about the heliocentric theory and said he can't use the Bible to support the heliocentric theory, I think it is. He talked about what the parallax shift is, which is how we try to find out the distance of distant stars. But the heliocentric theory. Dennis Venema was claiming that the people who, in the past, thought that the sun moved around the earth have just as strong of a case, or very similar to, those who fit the young earth creationist model of belief. Of course, that is, if anything, he's the one who's more like the geocentric people, believing in things because of just public pressure or popularity and not actual good evidence. He claimed that there had to have been 10,000 people in the past when people began. He claims that his theory complements, or the theory of evolution complements the Bible. No, it doesn't. He tried to show young earth creationist inconsistencies and he failed. Uh, yeah. It's been a while. It's been a good week since I watched this. I didn't find anything he said convincing about that. Young Earth creationists believe in rapid speciation, but not with humans. And he said, if evolution is true, we'll see overwhelming similarities with subtle differences. There is a young Earth creationist named Todd Wood, who's a scientist that Dennis Venema looks up to very highly. And he said Todd Wood wants young Earth creationism to have a solid scientific footing. Dennis Venema claims pseudogenes are proof of evolutionism, not proof that things are breaking down or not working as well, or that we're degenerating in a fallen world. He had photographs of ruins, stone-walled buildings where some of the walls are still up. He had a photograph of an oxbow lake. He's claiming pseudogenes prove the common ancestor, like the walls prove there used to be a house there, or like an oxbow lake proves that the river used to curve. Of course, an oxbow lake is what you get when a river curves, but at some point in the time of this river, it straightens out, and where it had curved before, it gets cut off from the main river, and then you have a lake there. Vitamin C. Okay, humans can't create our own vitamin C. There are some animals that can create their own vitamin C. Apes are animals also that cannot create their own vitamin C, and Dennis Venema sees that as proof. Let's see, show mutations. Dennis Venema talked about how they found a gene for egg-laying animals. There's a gene, of course, in egg-laying animals that tells the animal in the egg how to grow, or does something about the young animal. And placental mammals, of course, placenta is the layer of material that is around a baby inside of the mother. If the mother is a kind of animal that carries the child. And so he claims that you can see the genetic variation where the one mutation, the egg-laying animals mutated to the live-bearing. He made the ridiculous claim that only populations make changes, not individuals. And so you don't need to see individuals make the big changes, you just need to believe populations can do it. But how does a population do anything? There's no such thing as a population that does anything. Individuals do things. Let's see. He claims that it's been scientifically proven that the variety we have in DNA of humans must mean there were 10,000 humans in the past. I've got another idea. What if speciation happens? What if mutations happen? Dennis Venema here is like arguing against mutations happening, which is ridiculous. He's arguing against himself. He claims that mitochondrial Eve may really have lived, but she was one among 10,000 humans. So Georgia Purdom made her next presentation in this exchange. She wrote that animal relationships will be restored. She wrote, that's my note. She was saying that she believes the animal relationships will be restored. That she believes when it says that death entered the world because of Adam, it was death of all things and even animals. We're not dying before the fall and we're dying after. She says the death that Adam and Eve were promised when they partook of the fruit was a physical death, not just a spiritual death. And she said that the heart is a mess. Well, the most important message she can give people is about salvation. She says the issue of origins does not directly affect anyone's salvation, but somebody is being inconsistent if they're saying you can believe the end of the book, but you can't believe the beginning. Dennis Venema made his next presentation, said God reveals things through creation. Yeah, but he doesn't reveal what Dennis Venema is claiming he reveals. He talked about an E. coli experiment, and he made an interesting point that Adam and Eve were not immortal because there was a tree of life that they were blocked from getting to after they ate the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now it went to the discussion area. Dennis Venema pointed out there is more diversity in some animals that Georgia Purdom would say are the same kind and are between humans and chimpanzees. And Georgia Purdom acknowledged that, yes, and that is actually a good legitimate question or point. One weakness of young earth creationism. Georgia said that the authority is, she uses the Bible as her authority, and the Bible is clear about no relationship between humans and the other animals. Georgia Purdom asked about the pseudogenes. She said something about pseudogenes, big picture. Then the audience questions, I guess these were audience questions. They weren't from the two debaters. First question was, define what's microevolution and how is it not macroevolution? Dennis Venema accused young earth creationists of being extreme speciators or extreme evolutionists because they believe all the animals on the earth are descended from those that were on Noah's flood, Noah's ark that survived the flood. The audience asked, are there any problems with evolution? Dennis Venema acknowledged that we don't know how life got started. He claims abiogenesis is not a part of evolution. I wonder how hard he's trying to get it out of science textbooks. It is a part of evolution if it's in science textbooks. It's part of the whole, creation story. That was, let's see, audience. Is there any evidence against biblical creation? Or anything that biblical creationists don't have an answer to? Georgia Purdom said that the Bible is her starting authority, or starting point, basically. She can still do good science. And I'm sure Georgia Purdom is honest about the difference between her religious beliefs and what the scientific evidence is. The audience asked them what evidence would make them change their mind. Georgia Purdom said no evidence would make her change her mind about the Bible being true. She's already firmly believing that. The audience asked, is there any evidence against evolution that would make Dr. Venema change his view? He claimed the differences are not just a world view between the way he looks at things and the way Georgia Purdom looks at things. Yes, it is. That's so dishonest of him. The more I hear this guy speak, the less respect I have for him. I feel sorry for his students, anyone who has to deal with him. He says it's interpretation. Let's see. He said if Todd Wood thinks something is worth a second look, is good evidence, he'll take a second look. I doubt Dennis Venema is being honest here because he's not convinced by the evidence. I haven't seen him. This is not the first time I've seen him, but I haven't seen him hundreds of times. I've seen him a couple of times now. But he isn't presenting really good evidence, really solid evidence. He isn't obviously convinced by good evidence. So if he's not convinced by evidence, he's not going to be unconvinced by evidence, I don't think. The audience asked a question about changing. Do they see themselves changing? Dennis Venema said, always open to nature. He gives God credit for nature being stable. We can do studies and learn about things, and there's steadiness in nature. The audience asked how to reconcile a common ancestor with the scriptures that say that we are created in the image of God. Great question. Dennis Venema, his answer to this one was not complete bunk. All animals have a spirit. That's a fact. Oh, it's not a scientific fact, but it's reality. It's a fact. So some people say, well, animals don't have spirits, so that's why they're not this or that or something. No, Dennis is right. They do have spirits. There are spirits in them. Let's see. He claims that the image of God is a relational thing. Wow, talk about redefining a definition. Image is what you see. It's what something looks like. And it always has been that. That's one word that hasn't changed meaning over time like let. So, image means what you can see. Dennis Venema is just as wrong on this thing as a lot of born-again evangelical Christians who say God doesn't have a body, we can't see God because he's real, but he's not real in that sense. But wow, no, like my son is, the image of my son is not because he's my son, it's what he looks like. It's ridiculous. He claims since there are some people who have deformities, that image of God can't mean what you look like because, you know, people that are born with deformities, then you're saying they aren't in the image of God. Wow, no. That's not, I think that's a bad argument. The audience asked about evidence of a heliocentric Earth. This was for Georgia Purdom. She said there's a man named Danny Faulkner who works for Answers in Genesis, who's an astronomer. And the Bible is neutral about heliocentric and geocentric, that debate. And she's right, the Bible doesn't have a lot to say about that because the Bible gives God credit for creating it and tells us how to behave. So there are some things the Bible doesn't tell us. But if Danny Faulkner has anything to say, she would defer to him because she doesn't study the astronomy. The audience asked about placental pseudogenes because that was one of Dr. Venema's claims of evidence for his story. And Georgia Purdom pointed out there are some functions sometimes in these supposed pseudogenes, so it's not a pseudogene, it's not a false gene if it's doing something. Pseudo-antibody diversity. She acknowledged that some pseudogenes are pseudo. They really might be, just not doing anything, but it doesn't prove the case against her. Oh. Yeah, one thing that pseudogenes might do is help with resistance to diseases. Maybe some pseudogenes are triggered when somebody gets an infection, and that triggers the body to survive the infection. Let's see, the audience asked, if Adam and Eve are not the parents of all, why does the Bible say so? Yeah, it says Eve was the mother of all living. Dennis Venema says it's a stretch to say that the Bible says they're the parents of all. Mother of all living is not a scientific statement by the Bible. It's a symbolic thing. No, it isn't. It's a scientific statement by the Bible. He's wrong on that. Start group relationships, yeah. Dennis Venema likes saying things are about relationships that since he says there might be actually there might be mitochondrial Eve that the start group. It's like Eve was the starting of the group or something like that. The audience asked, how no 24 hours eat not die? How do we know that like the days of Genesis are 24 hours if in Genesis 2 it says in the day thou eatest thou shalt surely die, and they didn't die? Georgia Purdom has said we need to look at the context and the context of the numbers. In Genesis 2 there are not numbers. In Genesis 1 it says the first day, the second day, the third day. And so that's why in Genesis 2 it's not talking about a specific 24-hour day when it says in the day thou shalt surely die. The audience asked if everything is from the ground and they have similar DNA and self-awareness and cognitive thought, how do you reconcile that? Dennis Venema says plants are not formed from the ground, and a dog has self-awareness. That was a weak question from the audience. A dog does have self-awareness. Some people here, Dennis Venema did put down and make a good argument against something that a lot of young Earth creationists say that's baseless. Dogs do have a self-awareness of people. Some people say, well, dogs don't have a self-awareness. That's why they're going to hell or something, or God treats them differently than people. Dogs have a self-awareness. The audience asked about germ theory. The laws reproduced. So we know about germ theory because scientific studies have proven there are germs. They're microscopic things, and those get us sick sometimes. In the past 50 years of fruit fly experiments, why don't we have some good evidence to back up the evolutionary story? Dennis Venema said 50 years is a short time. Don't expect in only 50 years time for to see evolution. And selective pressures. But Dennis had a weak point here. The question's really good. We should see some evidence. Fruit flies, scientists have been doing everything they can do to encourage mutations and then separate the mutated fruit flies to try to get different flies, to get the flies to not be flies anymore, but to mutate to something else. But you just get deformed flies, and they haven't gotten anything that's a different kind of animal. The audience asked about the difference in poetry and prophecy writing and the wording in the scriptures, and was claiming that Genesis 1 through 11 is poetry. Georgia Purdom stated Genesis chapter 1 is a historical narrative style of writing, not poetry. I agree, it looks a lot more like historical writing than poetry. Now, Psalms 104, that's poetic. That's not trying to give you details, about things like Genesis 1 is. The audience asked, fossils don't show changes. Is that true? And Dennis Venema claimed that transition... something about the human relatives and transitional fossils. What did he say? Dennis Venema believes there are transitional fossils. Let's see, Georgia. No, but I'm trying to remember what. I should have written more detailed notes there. Yeah, I'm not remembering really well what his answer was to that one. Georgia Purdom quoted Richard Dawkins, who said that change is so slow you wouldn't expect transitional fossils. She doesn't expect transitional fossils, and the transitional fossils is based on the belief of a common, universal, common, universal, Kuna? Is it Kuna? Last ancestor. The audience asked a question about the mechanism for such long life in the Bible, because there are more than one person in the Bible that lived to be over 900 years old. All of them were before the flood of Noah, or the flood in the days of Noah. It was God that did the flood. Georgia Purdam's answer to how they could have longer life then is Adam and Eve were perfect. They were the first thing God made. There were not genetic mutations that could end life building up in them like we have now. And there might have been a different environment that would help them to live long. Dennis Venema said those numbers aren't accurate, but they're a mathematical pattern to make theological points and not historical points. Georgia Purdam said she never heard that theory before and she would look into that. Let's see. Then they made closing statements. Georgia Purdam thanked everyone for coming. She congratulated the audience for coming out to watch such an important topic. She talked about how they have the same evidence they're looking at. The difference between the two of them is whether they make the Bible their authority or the words of man and the ideas of men their authority. Genesis 1 is not an isolated thing. It's foundational to the whole story of the Bible. And she gave examples of things that are not scientific, but as a Christian we must believe. Trying to invite other Christians to be young earth creationists too that aren't yet. The example she gave was a virgin birth. It's not a scientific thing. It's very unscientific to believe that any woman ever got pregnant without a male sperm being a part of the process. And her having sex to get the sperm in there. Dennis Venema, his closing statement was to point out that he is a Christian, and if you find evolutionism convincing, you don't need to walk away from your Christian faith. Alright, thank you for watching my summary of this debate. You have a good day. That's